Hey guys, hope everybody's doing all right. It's Wednesday night. I think well, yes, it is Wednesday night. So when you watch this, maybe tomorrow, this will be pretty fresh. Had a chance to look over your questions, and I plan to address at least some of them in due course. I think what I'm going to do is make two shorter videos rather than one longer one. In this first one, I'll give you a little bit of background on sort of where we're going from. Well, first I'll start by introducing Unit 3 and talking a little bit about where we're going from here in the course. I know there's not a whole lot of time left, but there's some. And then I want to introduce Meister Eckhart by talking about the broader environment in which he worked, and then talk a little bit about his own life. So we're entering in this course the period known as the late Middle Ages. So we've been in the high Middle Ages, we're entering the late Middle Ages. This is a period from roughly 1300 to 1500. And if you remember anything about this period of time from humanities, you know that it's not the most glamorous period to be alive in Western history. In fact, it's a pretty bleak period in a number of ways. Some ways that are uncomfortably familiar to us now. There was a major pandemic in the 14th century, the Black Death. So I guess whenever we need a little perspective in life, we can always think about the Black Death. But on the ecclesiastical front, it was a really rough time as well. There was almost constant struggle and fighting between kings and emperors on the one hand and popes on the other hand. Indeed, the papacy really, the prestige of the papacy plummeted during this period, thanks to the 1-2 punch of the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism. The Avignon papacy is that, roughly 50, 60-year period in the 14th century when the popes resided not in Rome, but in Avignon in southern France. And then right after the Avignon papacy came to an end, we have the beginning of the Great Schism, which is going to spill over into the 15th century. This is that period of time when there were at least two, sometimes more, competing candidates for the papacy. So this was a time of great ecclesiastical scandal and intrigue. That's an important part of the story. But another side of the story is that the late Middle Ages, in particular, of all the Middle Ages, remember the Middle Ages is roughly a millennium-long period. It's the last 200 years of the Middle Ages that is perhaps the golden age of Christian mysticism. And so from this point on in the course, we're not going to be reading any more scholastic theology, even though scholastic theology continued to be written. We're going to be focusing on mystical or spiritual theology, in particular on vernacular mysticism. Everything that we are reading from this point on in the course, including Eckhart, was written in a vernacular language. And so far, that's only been true of Mechthild. So we have barely read any vernacular literature at all in this course to this point. From now on, that's all we'll be reading. And speaking of Mechthild, one of the other really exciting aspects of the late Middle Ages is the sheer volume and quality of the mystical theology being written by women. Now, of course, because we know about people like Mechthild, we know that this is not the first period in which Christian women started writing mystical literature. But this is actually, if you're looking at the whole 2,000-year history of Christianity, and you wanted to find a 200-year period in which you could find the most theology written by women of a really, really high caliber, it might well be this period, the late Middle Ages. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain this outburst of mystical creativity during this time of economic and ecclesiastical and social decline. Well, it may be that actually these two developments are sort of inversely related to one another. It may be the fact that it seemed like the world and the church was going to hell in a handcart. This may well have induced more and more people of a serious spiritual bent to turn inward and to really develop um, a kind of interiority. And we see this certainly among some clerical and monastic Christians, but we also see this pursuit of inwardness among lay Christians as well. So that is the really broad backdrop to Meister Eckhart. Now I want to talk a little bit about his kind of geographical situation and the religious milieu in which he found himself, and then I'll get into Eckhart's own life. It's really hard with Eckhart because he is so unique. He is so distinctive. So many of his ideas seem to be really out of keeping with his era. In fact, you might be interested to know that a number of people have written on interesting affinities between his mysticism and Zen Buddhism. Now, we're quite sure that Eckhart didn't know anything about Zen Buddhism. Yet the very fact that people have found all of these interesting parallels between the two just suggests how eccentric, in some ways, Eckhart actually was. But he is also a product of his own time. No one can totally escape their own history. And his geographical setting is significant here. He spent most of his career in an area known as the Rhineland, like as in the river Rhine, Rhineland. This basically sort of is central western Germany, stretching from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south. What can we say about what's going on in the Rhineland during this period of time? Well, you've got the rapid growth of the Dominican order, especially among women. By Eckhart's time, there are about 70 Dominican convents in the Rhineland alone. And many of these Dominican women were given spiritual direction by male Dominican friars. In fact, that became a really important part of the vocation of Dominican friars at this time to sort of act as spiritual guides to Dominican women. And this creates a real interesting kind of mystical synergy because you've got these highly educated, spiritually serious Dominican friars who are interacting with equally spiritually serious and often highly intelligent, if not formally educated, Dominican women. And interesting things happen as a result. But there are other interesting kind of devotional and sort of quasi-monastic developments too. There's lots of Beguines in the Rhineland during this time, as well as some Beggars. Remember, this is the male equivalent of the Beguines. So all of this creates an environment that's going to be extremely productive and fertile in terms of mystical theology, even though, again, the 14th century is a real low point in some way in terms of the institutional church. It's in many ways a high point in terms of spiritual or mystical theology. Just to give you some idea, I've got a book here by Bernard McGinn, The Harvest of Mysticism in Medieval Germany. This is a 700-page book that's just about mystical theology in Germany in the late Middle Ages. Okay, so there's a lot going on. All right, well, let's get to Eckhart himself. I'm only going to touch on a few aspects, a few milestones in his biography that I think are significant. First and foremost, he becomes a Dominican friar as a young man and remains a Dominican until his death. He's highly educated. It's quite possible that he studied with Albert the Great in Cologne. That would be very interesting if he was, because that would be one of several things that Meister Eckhart has in common with Thomas Aquinas. They're both Dominican friars. They both, at least may have, studied with Albert the Great. And they will both end up teaching at the University of Paris. And by the way, just chronologically speaking, there is a little bit of overlap between the two, but Aquinas is much older. So when Eckhart is born around 1260, Aquinas is already in his 40s. So Eckhart studies theology in Paris during a time in which there's still lively conversations happening about the proper relationship between philosophy and theology. And in this respect, Eckhart is very much on board with Thomas and with most Dominicans in thinking that philosophy is crucial for Christian theology. There's a famous quote in Meister Eckhart's commentary on John where he says this, quote, Moses, Christ, and the philosopher, of course you know who the philosopher is, Aristotle, Moses, Christ, and the philosopher teach the same thing, differing only in the way they teach. Well, that's quite a claim, right? That Moses, Christ, and Aristotle all teach the same thing. They just differ in their means of teaching. Now, you might not realize this or deduce this from the sermons that you read, but Meister Eckhart, as befits his education, was very much a scholastic theologian, or at least a theologian who could operate in the scholastic mode. He wrote several works in Latin that took up a lot of the same kind of questions that classic scholastics like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas tackled. So Meister Eckhart, like Bonaventure, is one of those figures who complicates the idea that in the Middle Ages one is either a scholastic theologian or a mystical theologian, because he really was both, and just in the same way that Bonaventure was both. The main takeaway, again, I don't want to sort of, we don't have time, I don't want to follow every twist and turn of his career, but I do want to make the point that despite the somewhat startling originality and edginess of his theology, he was not a marginal figure in the Dominican order or in the church at large. He held several important positions, administrative positions in the Dominican order. He was invited not once but twice to teach at the University of Paris. This is a very high honor that he shared with Thomas Aquinas. And in 313, he becomes special vicar for the Dominican Master General in Strasbourg. And there were 7 Dominican convents in Strasbourg. There were multiple Beguine houses in Strasbourg. And there, he really embraced the spirit of the pastoral life. He did a lot of preaching. He spent a lot of time giving spiritual counsel. May well have preached to Dominican nuns. It's really kind of hard to know exactly who was sitting in the audience for these sermons. Mandy and Ellie both asked about the audience of these sermons, which is a great question because you're sitting there reading them thinking, who in the world is sitting there hearing this, and what in the world would they have made of it? So we're not quite sure who's sitting there, but I can tell you one thing for sure, and that is that these sermons were preached in the vernacular. Okay, so all 3 of the sermons that we read are written in the vernacular, specifically Middle High German. Okay. So presumably he is not preaching to an audience that was formally educated. I mean, maybe there's a few people in the crowd who had a formal education, but probably his assumption was that people did not have a formal education, which is which is interesting because that's a real question. Can you really understand Meister Eckhart without a certain background in theology and philosophy? Okay, well, let me kind of skip to the end. Unsurprisingly, Meister Eckhart stirs some feathers and gets himself into some trouble, was actually accused of heresy by the Archbishop of Cologne in 1326. He appealed to the Pope, but actually died in Avignon in 1328, still waiting on the papal verdict. The papal verdict did eventually come, but it came posthumously, came the next year in 1329. The Pope, John the 22nd, had looked at a number of passages from Eckhart's writings, 28 of them, and Pope John the 22nd came to the conclusion that of those 28, 17 were substantively heretical, and the other 11 were at least problematic in terms of the tone and the rhetoric that he used. Now, of course, what the Pope was trying to do is discourage people from reading Eckhart. He didn't want Eckhart's influence to spread, and he was largely unsuccessful in that. Eckhart is someone who was read pretty enthusiastically by a wide array of people in the Middle Ages. But he is certainly not, and probably never will be, Saint Eckhart, not at least in this life. I'm not going to speculate on the next. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, give you a little break, and part two will delve into the sermons and engage more with some of your questions.